Okay, you can just monitor. You get the sound.
Yeah, looks good.
First of all, I want to thank you. Okay, let me tell you what we're doing. Basically, I'm dealing with Thompson Orphanage, the history of Thompson Orphanage.
Okay.
And I, by the way, teach history at UNC.
Yeah.
I've been there forever.
Yeah, I know some of your work.
But we're trying to go broader than just one orphanage. We're trying to deal with the whole system of child protection, child welfare, how it's evolved, and so forth. And the first thing I'm going to deal with when we get into it, I'm going to start asking you about orphanages.
Okay.
I'm going to read you some quotations from a couple of books here. One quotation will start it off. But just to begin, would you give me your full name?
I'm Robert Louis Herman-Smith.
How do you spell it?
Lewis.
And is it Herman-Smith?
It's Herman-Smith, yes.
What is your position at the University of North Carolina?
I'm assistant professor, Department of Social Work.
Okay, now, I don't know if you know, have you ever heard of Richard McKinney?
I have, yeah.
Well, I'm actually going to be interviewing him.
Oh, that's great.
And I've been corresponding a good bit with Richard. And I've got one book of essays, Home Away from Home, that he compiled. And I've also got his book about his experiences at Berrien Springs called Home.
Okay.
And I'm going to read you a quotation. And what I want you to do is just give me your reaction.
Okay.
And you can talk for as long as you want to about this. Let me read it to you. Progressives roundly attacked the 19th century asylum idea, arguing that the asylum was unhealthy, that it was a warehouse, and that it emotionally stunted its residents. Children in particular, they claim, were hurt by asylum or orphanage living. Children needed a home. Locking children in large dormitories, or barracks, as the progressive called them, deprived youngsters of needed warmth and succor. Instead of saving children from the ravages of the city, as the half-orphan asylum managers had thought, progressives claimed that asylums or orphanages in reality were creating the social misfit of the next generation. What's your reaction to that?
I think that there's a grain of truth in that. I think there's a grain of truth in the statement that progressives roundly criticized orphanages, didn't recognize that there was any value in the orphanages or the institutions. So I think that there is some claim to be made there that the progressives were too hard on the orphanages. On the other hand, there were orphanages that were terrible, that were horrible places, where children were abused, where children were warehoused, where children were basically neglected, and they were probably no better off than they were in some cases on the street. We know now that there were some orphanages where children were abused, physically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, and no one believed them. There was really nowhere for these kids to go. So I could see that there would be somewhat there would be some part of the argument that I could agree with as far as criticizing progressives. But on the other hand, there were actually horrible places. What kids really need is they need safety, and they need stability, and they need security. And so you can meet those needs in institutions if the institutions are run really well. But what we know now about what children need, if you were to bring back orphanages now, they would be very expensive to run. because we know that now that kids actually do need, especially the younger they are, the more they need individual attention. They need one-on-one attention. They need at most 2 or 3 people that they can go to look for things that they need, whether it's food or a hug or whatever it is. So we know now a lot about brain development. We know now that there's a really a need for kids to have lots more individual attention than they would ever have gotten in orphanages. On the other hand, there are kids in foster care who are in not very good situations. Constant monitoring has to go on to be sure that kids who are in foster care now aren't being abused in any sort of way. It's very hard to recruit foster families to deal with these kids. These kids have a lot of problems. It's really good. Frankly, it's difficult to get really good families who can provide a lot of structure and can provide a lot of resources to the child, because usually the people who have that in our society now, middle class people, they have jobs, careers, they have a routine, and a foster child is very disruptive to that routine, and they really don't want to have to deal with those kids and bring them in. So you can provide that safety and stability and security in an institution, but it would have to be very different than the orphanages that we knew a long time ago. You also can provide that in a foster care setting if you're able to recruit the right people, but there is no perfect solution.
One of the things interesting about the progressive issue, and directly related to constant orphanage, was a report that was issued by the Diocese of North Carolina in 1959.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who was the chair of the committee that put together that report, in many ways, is the personification of progressive.
Mm-hmm.
His name, and he still is alive, and is a very well-known figure among liberal theological circles, was a man named John Shelby Spong.
Right.
Spong was very, very critical of the constant orphanage. He was very critical of it on basically 3 grounds. One was, he said that they were exploiting the labor of these children. They essentially ran a dairy farm, and the children had to get up in the morning and go and milk cows and do all the things that you have to do with cows, including shoveling the waste matter and all of the things. And Shelby said that the orphanage was spending more money on cows than it was spending on children, and that this was really a bad thing to have these children doing. The girls, whether it be in the laundry or it be in the kitchen or wherever it was, that they were exploiting the labor of these children. What's your response to that?
I really don't know about the circumstances of that time. I think that by the late 50s, early 60s, that it was clear that there had been some abuses in orphanages that were supposed to be caretaking facilities for children. And I think that a lot of ideology came in at that point to then start to justify why we needed to shut these places down. So there were places where they were being exploited. There were places where children were being abused in orphanages. But I think after that discovery came an ideological attack on orphanages and on the old way of doing things. So that if we could just provide kids with real homes and loving families, put them in a real home somewhere that they would be a lot better off. But beforehand, during the orphan trains, when children were shipped out west, those children were placed into homes, and people said the same thing about them. There were cases where children were exploited. There were cases where children went into homes and basically served as the servant of that family and were not treated. There were other situations where, wow, it was a great family situation. They had a lot of love and caring, and the children were very grateful. They were very well loved. So I think that there was a recognition that orphanages and institutions, period, during that time, there was a lot of recognition that institutions had failed us, psychiatric hospitals, workhouses, poorhouses, orphanages, But I think that Spong made an ideological attack on, or he was coming from an ideological position. And I'm not sure that it was fair to say that about Thompson's, though I'm sure, I don't know, there could have been situations where where children were being exploited, but it just sounds to me like an ideological attack. Just like with Richard McKenzie, I think a lot of his rhetoric is very ideological. He attacks progressives and liberals and those people that, don't value hard work and don't value tradition and so forth. But I don't know that to say that we should bring back orphanages like they used to be, I think it really depends on the quality of the orphanage. And a lot of his work sounds like an ideological attack. He's coming from, a right, from the ideological right, and attacking things on that grounds. One of the things that I know about him is, he was really impressed with a reunion of some of the graduates of Barium Springs, and when he came back, the thing about that though is he was only seeing the people who were graduate. I mean, they had hundreds of kids coming out of there. He was only at a reunion with people who had done okay, because those are the people who tend to show up at reunions, people who've done okay. Also, there are people who could afford plane tickets, who could afford to get a hotel for the night, and those sort of things. So there are thousands, perhaps, people that he didn't interview. Even his own brother, who won't talk about his experiences at Thompson's. So it wasn't universally positive. And, to say, oh, we should just bring back the orphanages and that is the solution, I think it's in part ideological and it's naive.
Well, I want to get back to McKenzie because that's an interesting comment you made, and I think one of the things that is contended, at least in this Home Away from Home book, was that one of the sources for criticism of long-term institutional care or even disadvantaged children came from professional social work.
Right.
That when professional social, going all the way back to the 19th century, the late 19th century, you had people like Brace and others who were taking up this, and then as social workers, as social work became more and more professionalized,
right,
that the professional social workers joined this chorus of basically saying that orphanages were not really a viable alternative within the child welfare system. Do you think that's correct?
I think that they were aware of some abuses, and there were some really bad institutions, especially as the progressive era began. There were some really bad institutions and bad orphanages. But the thing about it is the social work profession, they tend to follow whatever the ideology is of the moment. They're very political. Social work and human services generally are very political. And so whenever someone came up with a new idea during the progressive era about we need to change things, we need to do things better, we need to individualize, we don't need to warehouse people in institutions, and God knows there were some bad ones, they jumped on it. There is a debate now, though, because we live in a time that's more conservative, and there's a debate about what these kids need.
Well, now, going back to McKenzie, he talks about the fact that, in fact, he talks about one brutal, they went to this cottage system. That's the way the orphanages tried to deal with making it more home-like, and then you get these house mothers or whoever was. And he mentions one, his nickname was Bowtie, that was very, very, beat these kids bad.
Right.
And when it was discovered by the higher-ups at Barium Springs, he was fired.
Right.
But what McKenzie would say is you have to judge what occurred at the orphanage, which he says provided the very things that you talked about before: safety, permanent stability, having, if you will, a secure place. He says you have to compare that with the life they had in the family that they were in, which was his father. His mother committed suicide by turning on the gas in the kitchen. His father was a abusive alcoholic, And he says if he had not been gotten away from that,
Mhm.
if he hadn't gotten out of it, so he would say you have to judge the orphanage in terms of its environment in relationship to the environment that they had in the family previously.
Yeah, but that's
Do
a
you think
different
that-
argument, because now you're arguing whether children should be left with their biological families or if they should be taken away and placed somewhere else. So you're talking about remaining with their families or going into some placement. That's a different situation. So I don't think that that's an argument for orphanages. I think that's an argument about, because that's a big push now, is trying to get children to stay with their biological families, not removing them from the families if they can help it, because too many kids wind up trapped in the foster care system, whatever form that takes, and it's hard to get back out of that. Some of these kids have been through a lot. They have behaviors and characteristics. People don't want to deal with that. They don't want to adopt them. And the worst thing, I think worse than anything, the way our system fails kids now is that we put them in foster care and they get trapped. And the worst thing you can do to a child is permanent instability, where they can be moved from one place to another over a period of years. And that is devastating. I would think an orphanage would be a much better alternative, or some sort of a residential placement would be a much better alternative than this thing that we do to kids now. The law has tried to address that. The child abuse laws have tried to address that by saying there's a limited amount of time when you have to make a decision, is this child going home or not? But then there is no law that says once the decision has been made to terminate parental rights, that this child has a right to a home somewhere. That's not anywhere in the law, and that's where kids get stuck. And it is a horrible thing to do to a child. Children who, by the time they hit adolescence, it's almost impossible to ever get those kids back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how things can evolve. Understand, I don't know nearly as much about this subject as you do. But as you know, the job basically of most of these orphanages was dealing with disadvantaged children.
Right.
These were children whose parents were divorced, or they did not have the financial means, or they were ill, or in some cases, of course, they were true orphans. But they were basically disadvantaged kids. As I understand it, one of the major factors that caused these orphanages to be, in essence, going out of business was, in a sense, they sort of lost a lot of their customers because of the emergence of aid to families with dependent children, or whatever, name it, temporary assistance to needy families, or whatever. Talk to me a little bit about a couple of things. Is that true that beginning in the 1930s and obviously expanding throughout the 20th century with more and more sort of picking up the old mother's pension idea and putting it into federal programs, what impact that had on orphanages, and tell me how well you think that system is working?
Well, I think that there were fewer kids going into orphanages because especially during and after the Second World War, parents had more money. They could buy more resources. They had more opportunity to get things for their children. Even something as simple as, this child's been getting on my nerves all day. I'm going to get the hell out of here and go down to the bar or wherever to get out of the house. But there was a lot more wealth accumulating in society, so there wasn't a need for as many, because there were many kids who got dropped off at orphanages whose parents were not very functional, who may have had alcohol problems or other problems that kept them from working, but they could drop their children off. And after a while, that became looked down upon because you can find enough resources to take care of your children yourself. And a lot of institutions started saying, "Hey, wait, we don't want these kids just because they're poor." So I think that had something. I think that there's probably some truth to that. But
we'll talk about the aid to families with dependent children. Talk about, you have two sets. It seems to me, you have disadvantaged children and then you have disturbed children. You have child welfare, and then you have child protection. Talk to me about how well you think child welfare is working. Disadvantage, how well is this aid to families with dependent children and its various names? I know it's been renamed now. But how is it working in your judgment? What is it? What is the program? What is its idea? And how is it doing its job?
Yeah, the idea is to be able to give people who are poor, for whatever reason, have difficulty working or have difficulty having a decent wage, to give them some sort of support that will enable them to at least survive with their children, to not have to give their children to an institution to raise, to be able to afford to have them at home. And that was part of it. Is we don't want to have a society where we have people who feel forced to allow their children to leave their custody. So that was part of the impetus behind that. And it started working. And even people who were poor could maintain their families and keep their families together in their homes. And so initially it was working. And then it became... And then you have two different camps on whether or not this continued to work and was a good idea. And I think I would jump right into the middle of a big fight if I tried to answer that question. And I don't think there's a good answer. I don't think there's a good answer. Did AFDC or TANF, did these programs keep children from going into institutions or into foster care because the parents had enough resources that they could eke out some kind of minimal existence? Yes, it did. Is that a permanent solution? That's where we have where there's a big difference in opinion. And I'm not sure that there's data that really supports either side to that. I will say that if you want to step back and look at things from an international perspective, the United States allows people, what we do is, the welfare state is there to keep people from hitting bottom. In Western Europe, their bottom is not as low as ours. We will allow people to get desperately poor, to have almost no resources, no recourse, to live in much more extremely impoverished conditions in the United States, because we believe in individual initiative and individual rights, and you should be able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Which is why, if you look at it, the United States has more children who go into foster care. They have higher infant mortality rates, more hunger or poor nutrition, more children living in poverty, more children failing at school. So we have all of these horrible indicators because we don't pick people up and support them until they hit rock bottom, and to do anything different is considered coddling people.
Well, let me tell you something I've heard from some people.
Okay. And
then you just give me your reaction. We've talked to a good many alumni of Thompson Orphan. Now, again, our selection process has not been scientific. But one of the things that they will say is they read in the newspaper, or they just hear it on the street. It just kind of, by osmosis, it comes through the air. That there are a lot of children living out there in a home without a father. There's no male role model. And that these young men, particularly when the testosterone starts flowing, many of them run into all kinds of socially unacceptable behavior. And you see them on TV screens all the time. Now, a lot of these people will tell you that have talked to me is these kids would be a lot better off in an orphanage than in a home situation that they surmise is like I told you it was. What would you say to those people?
I think that's absurd. The idea that a child is better off without a family, without someone who cares about them. What happens with the kids who don't get adopted in the foster care system, or even the kids who do? they go back to these families, no matter how bad it was. And I don't know where it comes from. There's lots of arguments and theories about where this comes from. But people want to go back to their families of origin. Is that something because there's something in our society that sort of gears them that way? Is there some sort of innate congenital condition that sort of makes you want to go back home? I don't know. All I know is that these kids always wind up back with these families. Whether they're adopted or not, there is some relationship. Yes, there are disadvantages in not having enough support in your family. If you have one parent in our society, it's very difficult to raise a child. It can be very difficult. And the type of assistance that we give to mothers who have children who are single parents is atrocious compared to what other welfare states give. So, it's a real setup. It's like once you're a single parent, then, we're not going to support you in any way, and anything that happens to your child is your fault. Whereas if they lived in some other country, things might be a whole lot better for them. But this idea that you take a child away from, even if they have one parent that they know is their parent and who cares for them, even though they don't always do the best job, but who cares for them, it just doesn't work. And if we want to do that, then somebody better get ready to fork over a whole lot of tax money, because that would be massively expensive. I guess some people could make the argument, well, yeah, it'd be better to take these kids out of a home and raise them somewhere where they're going to be taken care of and where they're going to get a lot of guidance, and that means if we put more money at the front end, then we won't have to spend at the back end once they're in prison or psychiatric institutions or these kinds of places. The problem is orphanages are no guarantee. Some orphanages are good, and some of them are not so good, and that's always going to be the case. So the orphanage or the institution is no magic pill that's going to cure the ails of these kids. And we know now that lots of times by the time these kids are, about school age, they're set. IQ, by the time you're 8 or 9, IQ is set. Your coping skills are set. Your gender identity is set. So all these things that happen beforehand, there's a subgroup of people who already, for whatever reason, like Mr. McKenzie, Dr. McKenzie, who already had a good foundation. So his parents provided him with his parents, as dysfunctional as they were, provided him with some sort of foundation that enabled him to survive, and he took advantage of that once he got into a better situation in the orphanage. But just putting a child in an orphanage is not going to be the answer. As a matter of fact, it would engender a lot of resentment, and these children would probably act out more.
One of the things that a lot of people quote has been at the orphanages, and they think it comes from the Bible. Mm-hmm. It actually comes from Daniel the Third. And that is, spare the rod and spoil the child. Right. What's your reaction to the concept of spare the rod and spoil the child?
You know what? I think that what these folks are looking at is, if you provide a child with lots of structure and security and routine is so important for kids, to teach them this is what you do every day. If you have a parent who's sober one day and drunk the next, or high the next, or is with you for weeks at a time and then disappears for a few weeks, that's what destroys kids, is that instability and that lack of a routine. So I think that what they're pointing to is the lack of a routine and teaching kids self-discipline. But if spare the rod, spoil the child means that, if you just beat them into submission, if you're just authoritarian enough and tell them what to do, that will fix things, we know that that's not true. A lot of the anti-spanking advocates have gone too far to say that if you ever hit your child, that the child is going to be scarred and traumatized. And that's just not true. On the other hand, if the primary way that you discipline kids is by spanking them, beating them, threatening and intimidating, some of these more aggressive tactics, you wind up with an aggressive child. Most of the young men and women that you see on TV who the people comment about they've committed crimes or so forth, almost all of them have had corporal punishment, and a lot of it. But it wasn't handled maybe in a consistent way. It was an excessive.
Let me tell you one story
Uh-huh.
that one of the Thompson people told me, and I just get your reaction.
Mm-hmm.
She was a young girl. You're talking about, she was maybe 8. She was, religion was a very important part of the old Thompson Orphanage routine. She went to the chapel, which still stands down there, and she was swinging her foot back and forth, and she accidentally kicked the pew in front. Her house mother, as punishment, made her go and stand up on one foot for a couple of hours and swing her foot back and forth, back and forth. What's your reaction to that?
I think that's excessive. I think it taught that child to be very afraid. If that's the kind of discipline that she received a lot of, well, I don't know. It kind of depends on the kid. Some kids will respond really well to that. Just like me, Mama would look at me, a certain way, and I would be like, "Yes, ma'am." My sister was going to push it every time. So it sort of depends. But that kind of thing it's excessive. The thing is, we live in a world now where kids have to make choices from a very early age. They're not with us all day. They're either at school or they're with friends or something. So we live in a world where you have to make choices, and you have to have a strong sense of self, of what's right and wrong. But if you just are beaten into submission, if you're punished into submission, you don't ever learn how to make good choices. You just learn that whoever is the most aggressive will win. And thus you have a lot of people who got lots of corporal punishment growing up who are more likely to have emotional problems, criminal histories, things like that.
Well, let's, by the way, it's very fascinating who you talk about. Oh, very fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about foster care now. And let me kind of make a statement, and I could be wrong. But if you take something like the current Thompson child family focus, whatever it is, they are dealing in an environment that is so different than what was true in the 1950s over on 4th Street. First of all, they're dealing with discouraged children. They're dealing with children that are physically, emotionally, sexually, either abused children. Also, when you look at Thompson Orphanage in its early years, from when it was established in 1886, it was private money. These were Episcopal churches that all across North Carolina that were giving their private money for this operation. Unless I'm terribly wrong, a great deal of the money that supports Thompson today is not private money, it's public money. Now, I went out to Thompson Orphanage to Thompson, out on Margaret Watts Way, to do some archival research. And I did not talk to the head. I certainly do want to talk to the head of it. But I was talking to some of the staff people. And I thought that I would hear this almost overwhelming condemnation of orphans. What I heard instead was a lamentation about the current situation. Now, you talked about the fact that we've now, beginning in the 1960s, we've got these mandatory child abuse reporting laws. And therefore you get this big swelling of reports of abuse children. As I understand, the idea of foster care was that this was to be a temporary situation where these children would be in that system temporarily. And they would get out of that system in one of two ways. Preferably, they would be placed back in their own family. And there would be considerable casework given to try to help that family to rectify its problem. If they did not exit that system by that means, it was through adoption.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and this is nothing new about a criticism of the foster care system.
Mm-hmm.
You can go back in the 1960s and people say, this is for many children, not a temporary situation.
Right.
Talk to me about what is, I mean, you know, the progressives were saying, let's look at various alternatives, and the best alternative is to have the child in a home situation,
Mm-hmm.
and the way we're going to achieve that is to use the foster care alternative how is it good?
Bad. It's not doing well at all. Because for too many children, the foster care system is not a temporary solution. It becomes a permanent warehousing. And children get stuck in that system. And it's because there are lots of reasons. One could be, and I know that a lot of social workers will disagree with me on this, but one could be that the child welfare workers were too aggressive, that they were too quickly to pull kids out of homes. Another is that there aren't enough foster families, that they can't recruit enough foster families. Foster families get a small stipend to take care of the child. It's not a money maker. I think that some people falsely believe that it is. They don't make money off it, but it's a very small stipend. And the families that they tend to be able to recruit are families who can withstand lots of disruption and people going in and out of their lives and in and out of their homes. And that's not true of a lot of the more middle-class families that they would like to recruit, because they value stability, they value routine, they value having the same family membership. They value they have lots of stuff and they don't want it torn up. So, so it's very hard to recruit foster families. That's another reason. And also for many years, and I think this is beginning to improve some, but for many years, there was not enough effort put into getting these kids back into the homes with their parents. The child welfare workers themselves became overwhelmed with the problems that the parents were dealing with, that they would determine it's better just to keep this child out of that home. And the only alternative we have now is a foster care system. And foster care, the foster care system, that permanent instability where there's basically a contract to keep you at someone's house, but that's not your home. That is very damaging to children. It's damaging to no matter what age, no matter what their background. It is damaging to feel like I can never have a place that I can call home. Would orphanages fix that problem? It would depend on the quality of the orphanages. If you decided you wanted to bring back orphanages for that purpose, to take care of kids who, for whatever reason, it was decided they cannot return to their families, but yet they're very hard to adopt out because maybe they had come with too many problems. Most people want to adopt young kids. Actually, a lot of people want to adopt babies. There aren't enough minority families. A lot of these kids tend to be racial or cultural minorities, and there aren't enough minority families who want to adopt them. And some of the wealthier families they'll go to a private agency and go international before they'll take a child that they know has been through a lot of abuse and neglect here. That's a problem. So I don't know. If you decided the orphanages was the solution for the kids who their parental rights for that child had been terminated, but yet no one was stepping up to adopt them, you could do it, but it's not going to be a guarantee. It would depend on the quality of the orphanage, and it would be a massive expenditure for the taxpayer. So the taxpayer would have to be ready to pick up the tab, to spend a lot of money to keep these kids in care.
Well, now, talking about sources of federal funds, and I'm really going out on a limb here. I might be saying something absolutely stupid. They have out at Thompson. They have some children who are spending the night there. They have some custodians. Now, in the case of Thompson, you would have children that would come at 7 or 6 or 7, and they'd stay till 18. They'd stay 12 years. nobody out at that Thompson facility now is staying at Clinton.
Right.
They're
Mhm.
Why are they not staying at Clinton? What are the impetuses for them to leave that custodial facility?
Because there is a belief in the foster care system. There's a belief that children need to be in a home, in a real home with a real family, even if it's temporary, and that's better than permanent custodial care.
Is there any desire on the part of federal welfare funds, understanding that foster care is cheaper than any custodial care?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any desire on the part of Medicaid or wherever they get their money to get them out of there and get them back into foster?
No. There is no push that I know of from child advocacy organizations, from departments of social services, from private agencies, certainly from funding agencies like Medicaid. There is no push to get kids back into custodial care, and I really do believe that cost is where the conversation starts and stops.
Well, why? And this is kind of a stupid question. We okay on time?
Yes.
We won't be that long. You have characterized the foster care system as imperfect.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I think you've characterized the foster care system as one that has some real challenges to it. I'm sure there's some foster homes that are good for it.
Oh, yeah.
You know that.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
I'm really
yeah.
concerned that what I'm saying is an indictment of foster care families, and it's not. These are very loving families that they really care about kids. They may not even have a lot of resources, but they're doing this because they love kids and they care about them. So I'm not trying to indict foster care families at all, and I feel like I've been overly critical. The families themselves are fine. The problem is the system doesn't know how to recruit enough of them who can provide the kind of care that kids need.
Is there any, well, then I'll go back to my other questions in a minute. Is there any training provided for foster parents? Is there a systematic training so that they are equipped to deal with the situation?
You'll have to edit that eye roll. Yes, on paper there is training, and they show up. It tends to be didactic. They just sort of, you come in and we'll talk at you, we'll lecture you about behavior management for an hour, and you have to do that as a condition of being a foster parent. You have to show up for these trainings, but they're woefully inadequate. What they really need is, but this would cost more money, what they really need is to have people who are available. It could be social workers or whoever, who are available to help these parents out, to whenever they run into something like, I'm going to have to let this child go if they don't stop, destroying all my whatnots, or if they continue to throw food at the table. I don't know how to handle this. They need someone there who they can call and say, these are some things to try with this particular kid, so you can keep that child there.
I'm sure you remember, somebody in your field, the fact that in 1994, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, and Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House.
I remember that well.
He actually proposed that the government might reconsider the orphanage, and there was an uproar. I mean, an uproar. What was your reaction to that when you heard it?
It's going to cost a lot of money. And at the time, I didn't have my PhD, I didn't have the training I do now, but I knew from having worked with the foster care system, even then, it's going to cost a lot of money. And that was my first reaction. That if you just taken over Congress with this idea that we're going to save the taxpayer money, then you are contradicting that when you say we're going to expand orphanages. So that was my first reaction. And then my second reaction was, you know what, that's probably a bad idea for the various reasons that progressives give. And then after I thought about it, I thought, well, it will cost a lot of money, but maybe for some kids that would be okay, and we should talk about it. And I I was disappointed that there was such a, I was disappointed that there was such an outcry about Gingrich's statements that we need to bring back orphanages. Look, I think that it would be something that, well, okay, maybe we should talk about that. Now, being a fiscal conservative as he is, I think once he understood how much it was going to cost, he may have backed off. But I thought that it was I thought it was unfortunate that there was such an outcry and that no one was even willing to think about this. And a lot of it has to do with the ideological positions taken by social work and other professions that no, children need families.
Well, you started out, one of the statements you made at the very beginning was there is no perfect kid.
Right.
Where do we go? I mean, it seems, do you think that our society is in some ways hypocritical about this issue? That we say that the children are our future and that they are the most vulnerable part of our society and we should care for our children. But in actual fact, when it comes to providing the resources, be it through private charity or be it through public tax dollars, we don't practice what we preach.
I think it's absolutely true. We don't practice what we preach. We talk about children being the future. But the fact is, in the United States, we don't like poor people. It's not the children. We don't necessarily fault the children, but we fault grown-ups for being poor. And if you are a poor parent, we are not going to help you. You brought this on yourself. You made your bed, you lay in it. I remember all those phrases that my grandmother used to say, about making your bed, you lay in it, that kind of stuff. You reap what you sow. So we don't like poor adults. The children, but unfortunately, we're impacting the children because we don't want to help poor adults. We don't want to help their parents. Why should I give money? Why should I give out all this tax money or other money to people who aren't being responsible, who aren't using birth control, who are just sleeping with whoever, who aren't taking care of themselves? Why should I be responsible for that? But what you wind up with is children who are impoverished, whose parents are stressed out and therefore more likely to abuse or neglect their children. And those children will grow up to be more people that people say the same thing about. So yes, we're being hypocritical. If you give children resources, if the parents have resources from the beginning, and the parents have those resources to use for the kids will probably be better off. Let me give you an example. I don't know how much of this. I'll go ahead and give a personal example. I adopted a child from the foster care system. I adopted him. He went into foster care when his mother was 3. He was in a different state, and they have actually more lenient child welfare laws. And so his mother called and said, "I'm on drugs. I just found my child playing in my drugs. I want you to come and get my child because he doesn't deserve to be with me. I need to go get clean. My parents won't take my child. My aunts and uncles won't take my child. They tell me, you had him, you take care of him." So she called, and the child welfare system said, "Okay, we'll take him and put him in foster care until you get clean." Well, she didn't get clean for 4 years. In the meantime, when he was in the foster care system, he was in 10 different placements from the time he was 3 years, around his 3rd birthday, until he was 5. He was in 10 placements because his behavior was out of control, and it was various reasons that he was in that. And he was also abused while he was in foster care by an older child. So when I adopted him, part of the reform in 1996, part of the reform to child welfare law was that we're going to provide stipends to adoptive parents or potential adoptive parents. We'll say, we will give you health insurance, plus we will give you a stipend to help take care of that child until that child is 18 years old. So that means that even though I'm not rich, but I'm a college professor, I have a PhD, I do okay, I get a check for $500 a month from the state where he was adopted, plus I get Medicaid until he turns 18. I don't have to buy his health insurance. That was because his behavior was so out of control, he was considered a special needs child. And so when you're a special needs child, you get these incentives. The system will pay you to take these kids. It's still hard to adopt them out because they usually come with some behavioral issues and so forth, unless they're adopted before they're about 3, and then you tend to see less of that. So I think frequently, what would have happened if his mother had called social services and said, I need you to come and get my child. If they had found a temporary home, if they had given her $500 a month to buy things for him and gotten her in rehab and said, we're going to come up with a contract and we're going to support you with extra assistance and we're going to support you with care and we're going to provide you with medical insurance for your child until you're 18, I bet he would still be with her. Because now that she's clean, she's really a very smart, decent, kind person, but she just went through a lot of stuff. She was a teenager when she had him, and she didn't get a lot of support. What she did, but I think that every month, what if this $500 a month check was going to her, plus she got medical care for herself, and she got medical care for her child until he was 18? Couldn't he have stayed there?
Is that child still with you?
Yeah, he's 13 now. And he's doing real well. He was in a special needs class for being behavior disordered and so forth, and now he's fine.
You were the good community.
Well, I wouldn't say he's fine, but he's doing better.
Well, you do practice what you preach.
Yeah, right, I do. But I do think that. Why? And I'm not sure she knows that, and we actually have contact with her because the research says it gets back to that thing I was saying earlier, that kids always want to go home no matter what that home was. The research says if a kid grows up knowing their biological parent, as long as their biological parent is stable, if they know who that person is and has some contact, they're better off. So we go out to Oregon and see her every year.
The one thing this book says is, regardless of what alternative you use, the most single important thing is consistent, ongoing parental contact.
Yes. Even for kids who have been abused.
Even kids in orphanages.
Yes. Yes.
Now, where do we go from here?
I think that we need to be more flexible in our system. I think that there may be a small minority of kids who, especially the older kids, because actually after kids are 3 years old, the percentage of them who actually are going to get adopted out of foster care plummets. And then after they're 10, you can forget about it. They're almost never going to be adopted. There'll be some exceptions to that, but not nearly enough. So I think there might be some situations where older kids, after they've been removed from the home, it's clear that they can't go back, that they're able to maybe go into some sort of an institutional type setting where they can get some structure, routine, it's real clear what they're supposed to do. And that idea that this is my home, this is where I stay, is so critical that I think that there might be room, if we're willing to pay for it, for some orphanages for some of these kids that you could continue to try to adopt them out, but those kids will tell you no one's gonna pick me. They know that. So there might be some room for that. I also think that the law in 96 was a real improvement, telling parents, look, you have a year to a year and a half to get it together, and after that, we're not going to continue to have you're not going to have rights to this child, because this child needs stability, and if you can't provide it within that time period, you're done as a parent. I think that was a good thing. So, and I think these kind of changes tend to happen slowly, but I think that has really been reverberating through the system and has really made a difference. The other thing that we haven't really talked about is kinship care. And there are many kids now who are removed from the physical custody of their parents, and they go to live with their parents' relative. Like they may go, if it's a single parent, maybe they'll go live with the father, or they'll go live with the grandmother, or with an aunt, or someone who's willing to step up and say, I'll take care of this child for a while his mother gets herself together. And that's a huge area of growth. And I think that could be one of the answers. The only problem is those families don't get the kind of support even that foster families do. They tend to they get checked in on, but it's like, okay, they're with a safe relative. those relatives don't get very much in the way of support or payment. The child gets health insurance.
We're getting the tissue. He's perspiring over on his face.
Yeah.
You're doing terrific.
Oh, okay, good. All right, good.
I mean, terrific. I hope I've asked...
You've asked very good questions for someone who says they don't know anything about it. You've asked the big questions.
I tell you, Mackenzie, I've actually, he's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
He's at the University of California, Irvine. He has a condo up in Winston-Salem.
Oh,
and he comes over here in the fall. That's where I'm going to go interview him.
Okay.
And, well, I want to get back to it, but I want to ask you one final question.
Okay.
But you've done, it's just, the thing is that, you doing okay? Mary?
Piece of toilet paper would be fine.
That's good. You just put fire over there.
Yeah.
Here's something I want to ask you. Here's what I hear from you.
Okay.
That the solution is very much dependent on the individual situation. That for some children, foster care is the best way to go. That they will indeed eventually end up in a good situation.
Right.
Whether that's through replacement with a family or adoption. There are other instances where children are reasonably, particularly if they're 10, 11, 12 years old, they've been in that foster care system for God knows how long. Nobody's going to adopt them. They've got behavioral problems. They might well need some sort of institutional care. Am I right that it should be that ideology should not drive this? What ought to drive it is practicality.
Yeah, ideology should not drive this. What should drive it is practicality. And I would even argue that funding shouldn't drive it, because when you do the wrong things with these kids, you end up paying, because these are kids who will wind up with lots of needs for psychiatric care and for or in the criminal justice system and with various disabilities, and you're going to pay. It's just a matter of when you pay. So it would be great if we could just set that aside, set ideology aside, set funding aside, and say, what do these kids really need? They need the law is right that these kids, if at all possible, need to stay with their parents, whoever they are. If the parent can get to a position where they're functional enough and can take care of these kids, that would be ideal. I think that kinship placement is also an idea, because they get to be with a family. They're with people that they know or at least have some connection to. And then I think there are kids who have been in the system for a long time. It looks like they might stay in the system a long time, and so those kids might do better in institutions, but they're going to cost money, because there needs to be lots of monitoring of the system itself, and the kids need lots of monitoring. But the worst thing that we do to kids, even now, is this instability. I don't know where I belong. I don't know who I am. I'll tell you about my son, who he was adopted when he was 7, had been in the foster care system for 4 years, went in around his 3rd birthday, did not remember his mother, and he insisted she was dead. He had heard that from somewhere, and he insisted that that was true, even when I had met her before the adoption and said, and we had talked. He would look like we would look through a magazine, or he would see I remember one time he saw an ad on the internet, and it was this real attractive, he's Caucasian, it was this real attractive Asian lady in a bikini on the beach, and he said, do you think that could be my mom? He had no idea of any connection he had to anyone. when he was finally adopted, and when he finally met, it finally talked him into the fact that she was alive, and then we called and said, do you guys want to meet up? Ask her, ask him. After he met her, and after she said, I don't wish that you were in foster care. I wish you were with me, but I was really sick, and it was not your fault that you couldn't live with me. I was very sick, and it took me a long time to get better. If I had a second choice, it would be for you to live with him. That's what he needed to hear. He came home, and I thought, oh boy, when we get home, it's really going to be there's going to be a lot of fallout. He came home. He put his toys away. He cleaned up his room. He put all of the stuff in drawers, arranged his toys the way he wanted them. And you could just, and he came home, and then he came down and wanted to sit with me and be hugged. He had a home. He had a permanent place. He had permission to be there. And after that, within 3 months, I saw a major decline in his disruptive behavior. He became much better.
Why do you care about this issue so much?
Why do I care about this issue?
Yeah.
See, I've asked myself that, and I think I grew up in an old country family about 90 miles from here in a place called Cat Square, which was beside a hog hill. No one has left that area for 230 years, as far as I know. And my family was the most important thing in the world to me growing up. And to me, it's unimaginable that there are children who don't have a sense of family, because that's all I had. That's who I was. It's who I am, was my family. And it's really just painful to think that there are children who don't have that. Every child needs that permanence and that stability and that sense of, I'm home. And even though that my family's changed, and even though I live very differently than my family now, and no one in my family went to college before, no one certainly got a PhD before, I still derive a lot of my strength from that family. And having grown up there, even though some of my relatives are dying off and I don't see them as much, that's where I came from. All children deserve that.
Do you have anything about that?
Where do you think that the problem stops? Or, we have so many children and so many families.
Mm-hmm.
How did it get this way? How did it get to this point? That's a big question.
It is a big question, but I have a big answer. Poverty. If you live in poverty in this country, you're more likely to be mentally ill. You're more likely to have poor nutrition. You're more likely to not get an education. You're more likely to have chronic diseases. You're more likely to have a disability. And I really think that poverty drives a lot of these terrible problems that we have. And if you support children from the beginning, and if you support their parents from the beginning, then you will wind up with fewer of these problems. There's no perfect fix, but you'll wind up with fewer of those problems. And also, I think the research is clear. If you support these single mothers when they have that first pregnancy, there's actually a program going on in Charlotte now that they're carrying out. They're less likely to get pregnant again. They're more likely to get pregnant if you don't support them. If you tell them, you made your bed, you lay in it. We're not supporting you. You should have done a better job of controlling your impulses. They're more likely to have more. Because in the world we live in now, shame doesn't work anymore. And if you pour shame on anything, you'll make it worse. So so these people make a choice that doesn't work out.
What do you mean shame doesn't work anymore?
We live in a world where we're not about survival anymore. People are going to basically live. They won't be real healthy if they're poor, but basically they'll live. It's all about a sense of who you are, and it's about making choices. If you shame someone and guilt them into doing what you want them to do, that's really damaging to people who live in a society where we are expected from the beginning to be able to show good judgment and make good choices. And if you undermine someone by having them feel ashamed or guilty about everything that they do, they're not going to make good choices. The likelihood that they'll make bad choices increases because they're not someone capable of making those good choices. They should be ashamed of themselves. They should feel guilty about the actions that they take. They're really no good. And that's very damaging to people now in ways that in other eras in history, maybe it wasn't. Maybe people would find a way to get through. It might have been damaging, but you had some way to deal with it. Now, we really put a lot of emphasis on you have to make your own choices. So you have to be a capable choice maker. So I'm sure there'll be people who disagree with me, but it just doesn't work.
Do you have anything to say that you haven't said? Anything that you want to say?
No, I feel like I've talked a lot. More than I expected to.
These ladies down?
I thought these cameras would intimidate me, and I just gabbed away.
Oh, you were terrific.